Thank you for being with us for part 5 of the London Center for Policy Research's special series, Red Alert China, where leaders from the Herb London Center analyze and break down the varied threats concerning the Chinese Communist Party with implications for the U.S. and the entire world. President Joe Biden perhaps thought the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan would be his historic moment, his legacy. Perhaps this blurred foresight and planning, resulting in a massive political and foreign policy blunder costing lives with potentially devastating consequences. The botched pullout now leads to several questions about the Chinese leadership and what they might do next. Will they swoop into Afghanistan, whether it be military or diplomatically, to try and control a strategic location and the flow of natural resources, and a swath of those? Will they take the botched pullout and current turmoil in Kabul and Washington as a proverbial green light to take aggressive actions against Taiwan and maybe other nations? The answers to these and more will be discussed today by our panel. London Center for Policy Research President Lieutenant Colonel retired Tony Schaefer, London Center Director Ambassador Hank Cooper, Distinguished Fellow Navy Captain retired Pete O'Brien, and Senior Fellow David Goldman. Please remember to hit that like button. Feel free to comment on our discussion. We appreciate your thoughts. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our Thought to Action channel and pound that big red bell for updates on future shows. Find more out about us at the London Center on our website, londoncenter.org. And if you'd like to help us continue to create discussions and programming like this, please join us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/thoughttoaction. You can enjoy sneak previews, a special exclusive content, and our Ask Us Anything sessions. Gentlemen, let's start with Tony on this one. What message or messages would you say the failures from the Afghanistan pullout are sending to China about the current crop of elected and appointed officials from the Biden administration?
Well, Chris, it means that the world doesn't take anything that President Biden or anyone on his staff says seriously. There's ample direct evidence. I mean, declarative statement by Joe take over Afghanistan. It would not fail. And everything he said in declarative statements has not come true. He was wrong. Then the response to being wrong was to be even more wrong, to double and triple down on bad decisions. It seems to me that each bad decision, whenever they had the chance to correct it, they went even further off the trail. And so it's a combination of what appears to be lack of resolve plus a complete detachment of the political policy decisions from the ground truth and facts. And that has resulted, I believe, in a number of adversaries and enemies preparing for more aggressive pushback and or expansion in areas of their interest. So that's what the end result is. And it's kind of one of those things. It takes time for the sound to get you. We've seen the lightning strike. The lightning strike is all of these shenanigans from the Biden administration. It's going to take time for that sound, for the effects of that to kind of wash over everybody and see the results. But bad results are coming, mark my words.
I absolutely agree with Tony. And I'd like to call everyone's attention to what it was like when Jimmy Carter was president. And Jimmy Carter makes really Joe Biden look like a real piker, because Carter at least foresaw problems that we dealt with, had to be dealt with, and so on. But the economy went in the trash, as you know. And then when Reagan came in, he immediately changed the signal. His signal almost immediately was when the air traffic controllers went on strike, and he fired them. And I know about this because at the time I was in a senior position in the Air Force, and we picked up the job that the air traffic controllers have been doing. And I can tell you from my later experience directly in negotiations with the Soviet Union, they got the message that they were dealing with a different animal there in Reagan, and he was going to manage, as he said, peace through strength and not through various accommodations and appeasement.
I would essentially pile on to what the ambassador and what Tony said. I think one of the things that really strikes me looking at this, not involved in the actual effort in Kabul, just watching from the outside as an observer, is that while there was clear, if you will, tactical acumen, the kids on the ground, the soldiers, the sailors, the airmen, the Marines, the junior officers, they knew what they were doing. But the signal that I would receive if I were just watching from the outside, the one I did receive is the senior officers are incompetent. That there is a glaring lack of skill at the operational and strategic level in the E-ring and in the White House. And that is the signal I would get. And I would add on to that only the injunction from Napoleon that if I were someone on the outside looking at the United States, the only thing I would say is what Napoleon said is never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. And we seem to be making one right after another.
If I could add to what you just said, and I'll go back to Reagan again. Reagan picked really good people around him, and they changed the scene. I mean, we had actually programs in place that we were trying to prepare that was actually begun in the Carter years, but Reagan's strategic modernization system that he undertook, his program that gave us a complete revamping of our strategic systems, which we need badly today because they have atrophied over the last 30 years. And that's because not just of Democrats, but both parties' ignorance, or I'll leave it on ignorance rather than malfeasance. They didn't do the job. And certainly Biden is not doing the job, and we continue to communicate weakness instead of strength.
This is the first time that a jihadist army has humiliated a Western power since the British were kicked out of Afghanistan, and it's energized jihadist movements all over the world. From the Chinese and Russian standpoint, this is an existential threat because both of them have substantial Muslim populations, which they consider a critical internal security matter. The Chinese are not remotely happy about the United States leaving because they've got 20 million Muslims inside China, and much more importantly, they're surrounded by hundreds of millions of Muslims in Southeast Asia and South Asia. To give you an idea of the scale of this in the long term, and the Chinese think very long term, on present UN population projections, there will be by 2085 more South Asian Muslims, Pakistanis, Bengalis, and Indian Muslims than all of East Asia combined. That's China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and so forth. So from the Chinese standpoint and the Russian standpoint, this is a major reversal and a collapse of American power, and they'll respond by massive involvement in Central Asia and West Asia, in other words, the Middle East, in a combination which has already been demonstrated by the largest scale exercises that any power has held since the Cold War in Central Asia. This will involve base building in Central Asia, military operations, intelligence operations, and so forth. This new Chinese-Russian combination is a disaster for the United States, and I think it distinguishes the debacle in Afghanistan from the fall of Saigon. Nixon and Kissinger had the brains to have the Chinese watch their back and deal with China so that the effects of the collapse of Vietnam, which they anticipated, would be relatively contained. This time, the Chinese believe the United States is trying to use the jihadist movement to destabilize them, an impression that we've occasionally encouraged. They're profoundly hostile to American interests and will do everything to sabotage us. So we've changed the strategic configuration very much against our favor and created a combination which is sadly formidable. It's a real debacle, and it's on Biden.
Your thoughts remind me of the fact that China actually is building on the technological capabilities that we pioneered in the SDI program, whereas the institutions of the American bureaucracy actually abandoned the most important activities that were progressing well on my watch when Bill Clinton was elected. And unfortunately, the second Bush administration didn't reverse those issues. The Obama administration certainly did not. The Trump administration did not. And certainly Biden is not. And so today we're playing catch up with the Chinese on a lot of important military technical systems, not the least of which is space. And, this is a dangerous component of the competition, if you want to call it that, which I would add to your historical comments. And I am very worried about this because Biden is doing nothing to reverse it. And so far, Congress is not doing anything to reverse the issue either. So we're wandering into the future in a world where we're playing catch up with China on that front. And it is armed by, if not imbalance, economic favoritism on certain key technologies that are resourced in China, are exploited in China by means of information technology transferred from the United States, in some cases where we cannot compete because we don't have the natural resources to do so. So we're entering the most dangerous period of my lifetime, is the way I would describe it. And I remember World War II. So, I'm very troubled by where we are.
Hank, thanks for that elaboration. If I could just add a footnote. This morning in the Chinese website, The Observer, very close to the State Council, the lead article is a statement by the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov saying, China is beating America at its own game.
And I think that's accurate.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I'd like us to focus on for a minute. Ambassador Cooper, from his commentary and other previous thought to action discussions, has brought up the fact that the strategic policies relating to nuclear weapons has a lot to do with the psychological ability of any power. We have, during the Cold War, we had huge ability to outthink the Soviets. The perceptions we were able to create was one of the best weapons we had. And David, to your point, we don't have people who have the ability to think in terms of how do we create a narrative backed up with technology to basically deter an enemy. And that was a big, and Hank, I'm kind of condensing a lot of what you said down to a very short series of phrases, but you guys were able to do that. David, it seems to me we don't have that leverage, and just as you just said, others have recognized we no longer have that leverage.
Well, Tony, I would only add, we don't have that capability in the government. We have that capability resident here, and it seems almost willful that the government, the bureaucracy, is trying to ignore those capabilities.
Gentlemen, let's go back to something that Ambassador Cooper brought up, resources. What are the chances that China will claw their way into Afghanistan, whether it be forcefully or diplomatically, to try and control a strategic location and the flow of a swath of natural resources, from building materials to rare earth elements?
I think you learned all you need to know about Chinese foreign policy by watching The Godfather. They keep their friends close and their enemies closer. Afghanistan is a very mixed blessing for them, obviously, because they're worried about the spillover of jihad into their western Xinjiang province and the Uyghurs. So they will use carrot and stick. They'll go to the Afghanis and say, we can make you rich. And the Chinese press is full of articles about the wonderful prospects of cooperation between Afghanistan and China. Electric vehicle batteries are, of course, one of the key technologies of the next 30 years, and Afghanistan has enormous mineral resources relating to battery production. So it could be very important for the Chinese. On the other hand, they will be extremely cautious about the Taliban. They simply don't know, and I don't think anybody knows, how the Taliban is going to relate to the globalization, the export of jihad, and they're trying to encourage them not to do it. So are the Russians. I think that's a side benefit for the Chinese. I think the key issue for the Chinese always will be internal security and the strategic balance with respect to the United States. That will be the dominant issue for the Chinese Communist Party. Economics will come second.
There's a reality that you left out that I think is an important overlay to everything you said that I agreed with. And that is the Islamic, I'll call it the internet among them, although I'm not talking economics. I mean, the web. I'm talking about their ties to Pakistan, Iran in particular, and already we were discussing China, but Russia as well. In our talks, we recognized the close ties that Russia was playing with these folks back in the day. I'll call it Reagan's day again. And I believe, if anything, they're stronger and more threatening today than they were then, largely because China has, I believe, greater technological strength, know-how, and economic strength than even Russia, which was our primary single concern in those days. And we used to worry about China, but we didn't consider them a peer competitor, which I think we do today. And the story with respect to Iran that I'm particularly concerned about, because their leadership is openly declared they just soon get rid of the great Satan, that's us, and the little Satan, Israel. And they, I believe, have the nuclear capability to do it. I wrote articles about this along with other former retired folks who understood what they were doing back in the day several years ago. I think our planning and posturing should assume that Iran already has nuclear capability because of their long-standing ties to North Korea, which has at least 50 nuclear weapons these days by most accounts. And they were present at the tests that North Korea did. They have been allied with them from the beginning. And I don't know why we wouldn't assume that they at least purchased, if not produced themselves, nuclear weapons that could be carried on satellites that they have been orbiting now for years. There are a couple of satellites up there that pass over the United States a couple of times every day. And I don't know where the missile defense capabilities in this country are today, but I can tell you when they put those satellites up there, we couldn't shoot them down before they could have delivered nuclear weapons, because our posture with our limited missile defense capability is based on looking toward the north, and their satellites approach the United States from the south. So I think there's an existential threat that comes from what I would consider to be an ally of the folks in, well, those four nations that I mentioned, and by their alliances with Afghanistan. And I think it's a mistake to leave that out of the picture of the world that we're confronting.
Apropos of your point, Ambassador, the first thing Russia and China did after the fall of Kabul was to officially bring Iran into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, yes, which is just one step, small step short of a military alliance, which is, should frighten us. And of course, the Chinese signed an enormous investment agreement with Iran a few months ago, whose content is still open-ended, but I think we can assume that that content is going to get filled up pretty quickly in the aftermath of the Afghanistan debacle.
And if I can jump in here, it's worth remembering, reminding our listeners that it was China that provided nuclear weapon support to Pakistan, and through Pakistan provided nuclear weapon development support to Iran, Korea, and Libya. Libyans, of course, turned it over back in 2003. But this is something that we don't discuss enough. But China is, if you will, the prime proliferator of nuclear weapons, and none of those design criteria are going to anybody who's our friend. And no reason to believe that that's going to change either.
To that point, real quick, Pete, and this is something I think Ambassador Cooper was intimately aware of. During their time, they had a good and comprehensive study of both what we were doing technology-wise and protecting it. That is to say, they were great, and same with you in the Navy, I'm sure. There were what we call operational security programs, which examined what the visibility was of our own technology, thereby trying to either prevent its leakage or acquisition by the other side, or at least understanding what they have. And at this point, we are so far gone from that. I don't think we understand fully what they can do. Hank and I spoke yesterday a little bit about vulnerabilities. Pete, we spoke about it. We have built ourselves a system which is dependent on digitization, which requires satellites. And those satellites are hugely vulnerable, and everybody knows it. And yet nobody seems to be willing to actually discuss that vulnerability in any realistic term, or what would happen if that capability goes away and we're left to try to conduct military operations in absence of all this technology. It's a very dangerous situation.
Does the military remember how to read maps or use a sextant?
Hank, I know this is one of my big issues right now, is that we need to have at least, and I've said this publicly, 2 to 3% of the standing military force and reserves, which are trained and equipped with what I would call analog equipment, World War II era technology that worked very well, worked very effectively to help people communicate. Because our friend, currently DHS official Bob Newman, General Newman, talked about one of the studies he was involved in, where only 2 to 3% of your force being analog would allow for a 2 to 3 times more rapid recovery of the larger force should you lose digitization. To me, it's a small sacrifice or set aside you must do to be prepared to bring forces back online should you lose satellites. And again, I don't think we're not being realistic in our understanding or preparation for this.
And I'll tell you, I don't know about you and your friends, but very few of mine carry a map around with them. They depend on the cell phone and GPS and whatever else. So without the capabilities you were talking about, they'll be lost. And we're just crazy in the way we're proceeding without any serious plan to deal with the reality of the threats that we're confronting. The Biden administration is providing no leadership that I'm aware of toward dealing with them, and neither is the Congress. Congress is more interested, it appears, on social infrastructure than they are critical infrastructure that's vital to our survival.
Having said all of this, will China take this botched pullout and the subsequent transparent political posturing in Washington as a proverbial green light to become more of a threat to take aggressive actions against Taiwan, Hong Kong, and other neighbors?
I believe that China's first reaction is going to be to try to persuade the Biden administration to capitulate on trade tariffs and technological sanctions and other things the Chinese want. They're going to test the metal. There have been reports that John Kerry was sent there with a very conciliatory kind of tone. If anyone's going to crawl to China in the American political establishment, probably would be Kerry. He'd be the right person to send for that kind of mission. We already know China's building 1 million 5G base stations this year. Where are they getting the chips? The Trump sanctions were supposed to prevent them from getting the chips, and they're getting them from Taiwan and South Korea. They're made with American technology, and we know that the Biden Commerce Department is looking the other way. That's clear from industry sources. So there already have been major cracks in the Trump profile of China containment. So I think China will first try to see how weak the Biden administration is and try to get a bunch of things they want before they take aggressive action anywhere else. That'll be their first response.
One thing that I haven't mentioned that I would encourage everybody to consider is in China's world of electronics and so on, they have been not only proliferating most things that people are aware of, but there are now several hundred large transformers in our electric power grid that we have purchased from the Chinese. And these large transformers, not just China's, but the ones that are built in other places, seldom in this country, if any. I don't know that we have any that we built in the last 15 years in this country still. We've never tested them against any of the threats, either cyber or EMP. Now, I may have to take it back on cyber because I understand that Sandia National Laboratory in Albuquerque has one that they supposedly are testing with respect to cyber threats. But I can tell you for sure, based on authoritative information that I have, that we have never tested any of them against EMP. And China now has, and we're still buying them, by the way, from China. I thought that when we learned that we had several hundred in our grid, that at least our leadership would recognize the vulnerability they were building in potentially, but I've seen no evidence that they have. And we're doing nothing, absolutely nothing to deal with this threat.
So to second what Hank's saying, I know from direct contact with individuals within the government that everything Hank said is absolutely correct. They have selected individuals who have not either understood the technology challenges or been willing to take it on. The chief of Air Force software just left and slammed the Air Force over the very thing Hank just said. So there are people who understand the challenge, but they're not in charge. And those in charge seem to be completely either compromised because they won't do it, or incompetent because they can't do it. I at this point, I'm leaning towards the won't do it, and they're compromised, because I cannot imagine this level of incompetence. Being incompetence is something else. So I think we have to recognize that there may be something else going on here. I don't want to sound paranoid. I don't want to sound conspiratorial. But if you just examine the objective facts, the systemic and continuous failure. One failure leads to the next failure expands. It's expanding failure. And the more you see of that, you got to ask, what's going on? And I think that's what we all have to come to terms with.
It's worth remembering, if I can just jump in, David, is that big tech is complicit in this. There has been repeated noise from big tech over the last really 5 years about the Trump administration's efforts to rein in the sale of chips, et cetera, to China, as well as the purchasing of certain technologies and equipment from China. And at each step along the way, it seems like the noise from big tech has gotten louder. And they are certainly making a good deal of noise right now about relaxing some of the rules that were in place put in place in the last several years, and relaxing those so they can increase the flow of, if you will, money into China and goods coming out of China at a minimum in the near term. And so they are complicit.
At the point where a quarter of our manufacturing GDP is accounted for by Chinese imports, all-time record, there's simply a massive amount of things we've forgotten how to produce. We don't have the factories, we don't have the engineers, we don't have the skilled labor. We couldn't easily produce them. If we put $1 trillion into rebuilding American industry, I think that's roughly what it would cost over 5 to 10 years. We could correct these problems. But right now, if you say, gee, we've got a Chinese transformer, who do we call to make an American transformer? You won't find that there's anyone in the business of making it, or anyone in the manufacturing world that has a remote interest in making it. So rebuilding American, after 20 years of gutting our industrial capacity, you can't push a button and make these problems go away. You need a really serious effort. Now, when Biden's talking about $3.5 trillion of goodies to hand out to his political constituencies, $1 trillion for our basic security should not be hard to find, not to mention manufacturing jobs. But I don't see anywhere on the agenda of either party a program of the scale that's required to fix the problem.
We're talking about throwing around now trillions of dollars And we're talking about perhaps $100 billion per year, or perhaps a little more, invested in real industry that would produce real jobs and provide real national security. And it whispering silence.
So on that point,
It's stunning.
yeah. Well, on that point, for all of us, one of the things to underline what David's saying and Pete's saying, and this is one of Hank's areas, is nuclear weapons and nuclear power. Our board member, Bud McFarland, is working on trying to reinvigorate U.S. nuclear industry. Think about that. We have nothing because of the left's insane focus on hating nuclear being probably, from all stats, and I got a degree in environmental studies, statistically, nuclear is the safest form of sustainable energy, period, bar none. It's very safe, despite the Chernobyls. That was insane. So my point being is that Bud and others are trying to reinvigorate that, because Iran, and obviously, if you do civil nuclear, it's pretty easy to bring and do military nuclear out of it as well. So this is where we need to get back on top of this. We have the intellectual and industrial capacity. We choose not to do it, and that's a real problem.
Can I just jump in on that, Tony, and add, is going right back to something Hank said earlier. The reason why our nuclear industry really unraveled was not 3 Mile Island, during which the result of which was no one died, but the decision made by the Carter White House to end the processing of nuclear waste. And if you recall, I mean, a lot of our listeners probably don't recall, the rationale for that was to prevent the nuclear materials from falling into the hands of terrorists. Now, that never transpired anywhere, not here, not in France, which processes a lot of nuclear waste, not any place. And yet we paralyzed the nuclear industry in this country on a screwy idea and a bad decision by the president. And it's long past time that should be undone. And we should go back to processing nuclear waste, which would eliminate 99.9% of the nuclear waste, and going back to building very safe nuclear reactors. They're much safer now than they were 30, 40 years ago, and providing cheap, abundant electric power to the nation.
Thank you for being with us for this edition of the Thought to Action Red Alert China series, presented by the Herb London Center for Policy Research. This is episode 5. Be on the lookout for number 6 in the series. That's coming soon. Please remember to hit that like button. Feel free to comment on our discussion. We appreciate your thoughts. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our Thought to Action channel and pound that big red bell for updates on future shows. Find out more about the London Center on our own website, londoncenter.org. If you'd like to help us continue to create these discussions and programming like this, please join us at Patreon at patreon.com/thought-to-action. It's patreon.com/thought-to-action. You can enjoy sneak previews, special exclusive content, and of course our very interesting Ask Us Anything sessions. You can even ask us questions. Also, you can help us greatly by sharing this video with your friends, colleagues, and social networks. For our panel and the Herb London Center for Policy Research, I'm Chris Cordani. Thank you, stay informed, and make your day a great one.